All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started up again. It's just so wonderful to have the teach-in back. I wanted to take a moment to thank our members of the audience for coming. I know some of you have traveled a long way. At lunch, I met with some folks who'd come from Dallas to the teach-in. We're grateful to everybody for their attendance. We've got people from high schools. We've got people from our OSHA Lifelong Learning Institute, faculty, students. It's just lovely to have the teach-in back. And something quite remarkable has happened. We've had a set of academic presentations, and everything in the program is still on time. So, big thank you to our speakers. My job now is to introduce Parry Limerick. Parry is the faculty director of the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where she's a professor of history. She has dedicated her life and her career to bridging the gap between academics and the general public, to bringing us together, and to demonstrating the benefits of applying historical perspective to contemporary dilemmas and conflicts. Turning hindsight into foresight is one of the monikers of the Center of the American West. In January 2016, Governor Hickenlooper named Parry Limerick as the Colorado State Historian, a position she served in until 2018. In addition, in January 2016, she was appointed to the National Endowment for the Humanities Advisory Board, the National Council on the Humanities. She's best known, perhaps, in terms of publications for her landmark work, The Legacy of Conquest, an overview and reinterpretation of Western American history that has stirred a huge amount of debate both within the academy and within larger public audiences. She's also a prolific essayist. Many of her most notable articles were gathered together, including the article Dancing with Professors, The Trouble with Academic Prose, were collected in the wonderful 2000 volume, Something in the Soil. She's received a number of awards and honors recognizing the impact of her scholarship and her commitment to teaching, including the MacArthur Fellowship, which she held from 1995 to 2000, and the Hazel Barnes Prize, the University of Colorado's highest award for teaching and research. She's also completed 2 terms as a Pulitzer nonfiction jurist and also chaired the 2011 Pulitzer jury in history. She served as president of the Organization of American Historians, the American Studies Association, the Western History Association, and the Society of American Historians, and also as the vice president of the teaching division of the American Historical Association. It's been a remarkable career, and most importantly, from my perspective, 21 years ago, while kindly hosting me as a visiting scholar at the Center of the American West, she took me to a Humanities Center event where I met Janet Ward, the founding director of the OU Humanities Forum, a professor of history here at OU, and also my wife. So, thank you, Parry, for the work you've done over the course of a career to bring people together.
Look at this brave move. Look at us. We just hugged each other, and there are terrifying stories of viruses, and we just hugged each other in front of the public. Boy, we are brave. Well, David is really brave, and I'm so grateful to him and Justin Wirt and Helen Green for bringing me here today. This is my second visit to a teach-in, which is kind of an unusual thing. That there are things that are hard to put in your resume, but they mean a lot, like only one of 2 or 3 people to come twice to teach-in, having introduced David and Janet. I can't put that on my resume, but what could be more of a source of satisfaction? So I shall start with a story that has a little bit of bearing. When I was in graduate school, a person who I admired very much, Kai Erickson, a sociologist, told us a story, and it drove some of the graduate students wild and enraged them, and it pleased me, I guess. So this is a story about a marriage counselor, And the marriage counselor is a medical student, is watching the marriage counselor to observe his technique. So the marriage counselor brings in, he says, "Will you sit over here?" to the medical student, brings in the husband, and the husband, he says, "Tell me the story." Here, the husband tells him a story about the marriage going downhill, and it is all the wife's fault. Everything is the flaws of the wife. So the marriage counselor listens very closely, and he says, "I think you're absolutely right." He takes the husband out, brings the wife in, asks her for her story. She tells exactly opposite story, and absolutely everything is the fault of the husband and all of his flaws. So marriage counselor listens really closely, and he says, "I think you're absolutely right." So he takes the wife out, and then he comes back in, turns to the medical student, and says, "What do you think of my technique? What do you think of my technique?" And the medical student said, "Well, I have to be honest. That was a disaster. You took a bad situation, you made it worse, you validated two conflicting stories. I don't know what you could have done that could have made the situation worse." The marriage counselor listened closely, and he said, "I think you're absolutely right." So that is a little bit of a character flaw of mine, that I do listen closely to people's stories, and I find them very moving and persuasive, and then things fall apart from there. So today's subject, I think, requires more than the marriage counselor's technique, so I will be more than I would ordinarily do, taking not exactly a position, but forcefully putting into discussion, I hope, some historical perspectives that I think would improve our nation's deliberations on immigration. We certainly have had much of that already, and wonderfully presented by our earlier speakers. I should tell you, and this is a little bit of a welcome to my world here, I am the very fortunate recipient. My Center of the American West has a very sizable grant from the Mellon Foundation to engage young historians in what we called applied history, bringing historical perspective to bear on the dilemmas and conflicts of our time. So that's what you're going to see at work here, is what applied historians can do. Applied historians can identify patterns in the past, and I will try that with three items today. And it is also incumbent on the applied historian to note the uncertainty that is unavoidable when we try to characterize and summarize patterns from the past. We also have to be the first to point out that historians are dreadful performers when it comes to prophecy and prediction. We cannot project patterns we observe in the past into the future. But what we can do is reflect on those patterns, and we can draw from them something quite useful for the present, a range of inspirational tales, cautionary tales, and tales that are hybrid, that are both inspirational and cautionary. I should say that my own political identity has become quite muddled. And I want to say very directly that I do not see a viable position in open borders with no constraint on movement. That does not seem persuasive or convincing to me. I am very taken, it's wonderful how sometimes a writer, Jason DeParle from the New York Times, just a couple of days ago, wrote this very brief, succinct statement, and I agree with this. Immigration poses a moral dilemma. There are more potential migrants than the country can accept. With nearly 2 billion people living on less than $3.20 a day worldwide, it's impossible to let them all in. Hence the need to set limits and enforce them humanely. I agree with that. DeParle also says that he thinks we've made a mistake in holding back on the economic argument, which in fact Alan Kraut did not hold back on that by noticing at the end there how important immigrant labor is to the economic well-being of the country and how many business people support that. I do want to say that acknowledging a significant margin of error is really important in this to reduce. It's a little bit of a paradox. I think if more people in the United States today who spoke in public and put forward positions would make a modest claim on certainty and an intense claim on humility, they would paradoxically be more trustworthy. So I just, because I think people in Oklahoma probably tell funny stories about Texans as much as we do in Colorado. Our team taught with a wonderful biology professor, of course, on water in the West, Michael Grant, and he does have quite a strong Texas accent. So he was doing biology, I was doing humanities angles on water in the West. At one point, he was lecturing on, I think he was lecturing on acid rain, and he was using a term I just thought so embarrassing in front of the students. I'm not a scientist. I cannot understand what he keeps referring to here. He keeps speaking of the margin of error. And I know that's probably the proportion of nitrogen to oxygen in the air. It's probably that, but I don't know what that is. And so the fourth or fifth time Professor Grant said something about the margin of error, I said, you'll have to tell me what that is. And he said, you've never heard of the margin of error? Haha, margin of error. Okay, good. So I think the students understood that I might be hearing impaired, but I wasn't as ill-informed as I seemed there. So, okay, so we're going to do 3 historical perspectives. One of them has been quite well covered already by other speakers, so I'll be very brief on the third one. I'm going to look at the North American experience of overland travel across deserts, and I'm going to suggest some zones of comparison in those episodes of travel that might make it easier and better to talk about, especially immigration from Mexico, Central Americans, as well as Mexican people coming into this country by overland travel. It will also do you good when you are at the airport, should you ever go to an airport again under these strange times. But if you do, when they inevitably, someone will announce at some point, we're going to have a 2-hour delay while we repair the plane or something, you will feel much better after this, because you will know, as I know, I am the cheeriest person at those moments, because if they say to me, we're going to take 2 hours before we can take off, and the other passengers are, oh no, all that time, I am the Western American historian thinking, this is so much faster than the overland trail. Who could complain at this point? So you're going to have that comfort too. So here is my historical proposition in pattern finding and in suggesting that we should reflect along this line of, I guess you could call it time travel, thinking of one era of literal overland travel and then a more recent one. Okay. In ways, this is a place where I have written this out to make sure I say exactly what I mean. In ways that thoroughly transcend the borders and lines of ethnicity and nationality, the history of travel across the deserts of North America records many stories of suffering and of human endurance tested to its limits and beyond. Sometimes that suffering has extended the boundaries of compassion, forging a life-saving tie between strangers. So, and I referred to an earlier speaker at this point, Katie Benton-Cohen, who reminded us that the American Historical Association says that empathy is one of the skills of historians. So, the crossing of the continent on the Overland Trail holds a central place in American self-understanding. It is a tenable proposition to say that a number of elements of American identity are tied to the Overland Trail, to Conestoga wagons and pioneers moving westward. If you then think about the enormous difference between terrestrial migration, maritime migration, migration by air transport, you can see that, in fact, terrestrial overland transportation is its own category and does deserve historical comparison in different eras. If you move across land by foot or by the labor of livestock, creatures that have their own biological vulnerabilities, that is a world apart from crossing by mechanical vehicles, whether it's human muscle or animal muscle, that is its own category. On the Overland Trail, that often involved walking because of a rightful fear of overburdening the draft animals. I'd also like to remind us that at the time of the Overland Trail into California, Gold Rush, 1848, 1840, then the big burst in immigration in 1849, 1850, remember how recently the United States had acquired California with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. So if we think, well, that was just Americans moving across American land, actually, that was really, really recent, and it is one of the most remarkable acts of human, I don't know what, nerviness, I guess, that the Americans barely take over California when they start passing things called foreign miners taxes, when they would have been the foreigners themselves just a year or two before. But timing is all sometimes. So if you want, now we're going to have a prize given to the silliest remark ever made by a Western American historian. And this silly remark was made by the first president of the Western History Association, Ray Allen Billington. This is a quotation from his book, Far Western Frontier, in which he summarizes the experience of travel on the Overland Trail in the 1840s and 1850s. The wagoners walked beside their teams, flicking their whips, while their wives and children scattered to either side to pick wildflowers or simply romp away some of the animal spirits bred by their healthy life. That is the prize winner for the silliest characterization of what was quite different. So, big picture, the Earth's primary obstacles to human travel, migration and immigration, are oceans and deserts. And they are the primary obstacles because they both involve shortage of drinkable water, shortage of potable water, and thereby the prospects for desperate and even fatal thirst. Okay, so all of the routes east to west in the mid-19th century involved travel across a desert and an intense experience of thirst, and also a realistic fear of death if the travelers did not find water in time. The southern route, going through what would be now Arizona into Southern California, the Sonoran Desert and the Colorado Desert, that was really, really tough. The central route, what is now northern Nevada, follows the Humboldt River, which is a ratty little river, but it does provide water to livestock as well as humans, and then it goes into a sink. Then it goes underground. Then you have around 50 more miles to cross before you get to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the eastern side. So that is a long spell, and you have to put water in casks and put them in the wagons, but you have to calculate, because if you put too much water into casks, you will wear the livestock down, and they will be susceptible to exhaustion and collapse if the weight of water in the wagon is too heavy. And again, if they don't have enough water, then they will die from that. So it is an intense experience of thirst, and that is unaffected by ethnicity or nationality. There are many stories of hardship on that, and I say this as human nature is hard to generalize about, but I do think you can say that for nearly every human who has been on the planet, seeing another human being desperate for water has more often than not been an occasion for sympathy and compassion. So what do you do with that sympathy and compassion? Do you manage and restrict it? Do you say that the people suffering thirst were victims of overconfidence and their voluntary decision to take risks? You could certainly say that of the people on that trail in 1849, 1850. Those travelers used the words barrenness, desolation, and dreariness. They had grim stories of seeing dead animals. On the southern route in Arizona, they would often get to a water hole and discover that livestock had died right there, so they could drink the water, but they could drink it with, we won't go into detail here. So, but dead animals would have contaminated that water. David Potter, a very noted American historian who edited a diary of the Overland Trail, made this observation: if the waterless stretch of the Humboldt Desert had been a few miles wider, the rate of survival on the trail would have been cut to a fraction. People who made that crossing used phrases very common: past the journey of death. It seemed as though we had passed over the scorching valley of death to life. Okay, one thing besides the fact that that desert was not 10 miles wider, another major factor in making the trail survivable was that Americans who were already on the Pacific coast launched significant relief parties. The historian John Unruh has discussed how the Donner Party calamity in 1846-1847 led Californians to organize relief and rescue operations whenever they thought there was a threat of the repetition of those events. So there were massive relief efforts mounted from Oregon as well. The Hudson's Bay Company did some of that, which was not exactly in their interest to encourage immigration, but also Americans in California. They did that partly out of economic and promotional motives. They did not see the reputation of California being enhanced by having a high death rate of people trying to respond to its promise, so there was certainly that aspect as well. Occasionally it was helping friends and family, but mostly it was helping strangers. There were public meetings to raise contributions, mostly private contributions that funded this, and I'll quote John Unruh: overshadowing everything was a vast outpouring of humanitarian aid by West Coast residents to needy immigrants. This assistance was of incalculable importance to incoming overlanders in Oregon and California. It was, as John Unruh, it was crucial to the success of the Overland Trail. So now the applied history transition. Overland travelers crossing deserts in the recent past we make a shift in the time period from the mid-19th century to the late 20th century and the early 21st century, and in the direction of travel, and we shift to the crossing of northern Mexico and then into Arizona and California. Certain policy decisions, making it harder to get into El Paso or harder to get into San Diego, drove the migrants into the driest areas. Here, these stories are very difficult and very painful to discuss, so I'll just call attention to this book. It's a collection, Migrant Deaths in the Arizona Desert, and it's very intense and very powerful about the human remains in the desert and the process to try to identify those people and to get their kin notified and so on, and memorials and efforts to learn lessons from that. And then a book that a friend wrote, my friend Luis Alberto Rea wrote this fine book called Devil's Highway. It's about the Welton 26 people who had a very bad guide in the early 2000s and who the great majority of them died in the desert crossing in Arizona. So now we shift to noting the Californians and Oregonians who organized relief parties and sent people back to rescue the overland travelers who were at risk of the desert and then, of course, had to cross the Sierras after that. None of those relief and rescue people were charged with crimes. People who put water in the Arizona desert for the use of migrants, for the redemption of the lives of migrants, those people can be charged and have been charged for civil and criminal violations. If you put water in, you can, if the law gets interpreted that way, you are harboring an illegal immigrant. So that's different. Nobody would have imagined charging the relief and rescue parties in the 19th century. Different context. Let me say really clearly, back to the uncertainty factor, the immigrations are not equivalent, but they are worth comparing. So if I could insert into public discussion those two migrations and their desert crossings, at least a chance to think a little bit more about our conduct today and how much we want to pursue that. One of the great parts about Luis Orea's book is the spectacular way he tracks how Border Patrol officials have to sometimes make, and seem to make with some alacrity, considerable alacrity, the shift from trying to track down illegal immigrants so that they can arrest and deport them. Then, when there is the word, as there was with the people in Orea's book, a notice of how at risk these people were, Border Patrol can shift instantly to a search and rescue team. Interesting, just in terms of not letting our categorizations of people become unitary and rigid, that the very same people looking, not in the least to injure or kill the immigrants, but you can shift from track them down, apprehend them, to save their lives really fast if you must. Crossing a desert demonstrates determination and a faith in opportunity. It is a physical, I'm not quoting anybody, this is just me. Crossing a desert with human muscle is a physical and material testimony to belief in the promise of the United States. I will end this little section and then quickly move through the next one, and then be really short on the assimilation part. Alonzo Delano was a 49er. He was crossing a cutoff on the Black Rock Desert, not far from where they now have the Burning Man episodes. He was walking in the desert. He was near the end of the cutoff. He was quite desperate himself. He did not know how much further he had to go before he would find the streams at the end of that desert crossing. He came upon a young woman and her small child left behind in a wagon. I quote Alonzo Delano's diary. "Where is your husband?" I inquired. "He has gone on with the cattle," she replied, "and to try to get us some water. But I think we will die before he comes back." Delano did not know how much further he had to go. He did not know of his own capacity to cover that distance, and he gave the woman his water flask. So, second item, which doesn't bring me to the edge of tears, I'm happy to say this item is just like, oh, for heaven's sake. And it does involve a good friendship of mine and an interesting bird, our former governor, Richard Lamb. Okay, here's on carrying capacity. I now want to shift to the common thinking about carrying capacity that has been in various eras and places around the United States. And it occurs particularly in environmental circles. So carrying capacity, and this is my careful diplomatic way of putting this, trying to answer central questions about the future of their nation. Some Americans over decades have had an understandable inclination to find authority in nature, especially for the idea that the arrangements of nature have made the essential decisions and relieved human beings of that burden. So in the mid-19th century, some Americans believed that the aridity of the American West prohibited the expansion of slavery by making plantation agriculture impossible, and for some Americans in the mid-20th century, some people in our time think that by setting a stern limit on population with the idea of carrying capacity, nature has framed and enforced an immigration policy that humans can briefly defy but eventually had to embrace. So starting in the mid-20th century and continuing in some circles from our time. So how to take this up? Carrying capacity is the idea that organisms reach the limit of their population because of the limit of the natural resources available to them. That is totally true of mule deer and prairie dogs. Mule deer and prairie dogs do not go to engineering school. It's a conspicuous limitation that they have. So they take what they have and they don't modify it. Humans have engineers. They modify the environment in all kinds of ways. They transport food with an energy subsidy. They dam water. They do all kinds of stuff. So ecologists often do say it's much harder with human beings. Nonetheless, a certain sector of human beings have said that the Sierra Club, for instance, has had a very big fight over this in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, that nature has a carrying capacity and we must abide with that. We must limit our immigration in order to stay within that carrying capacity. I tried to think, how could I take this up with a case study, and then I thought, oh, my friend Governor Richard Lamb, he's the former governor of Colorado. We have debated immigration a couple of times, and he is quite the case study in this. In our debates, everything I say now I've said in public and had him respond to me. So here are Dick Lamb quotations. The West teaches us that there is such a thing as carrying capacity and that we must respect the fragility of the land and the environment. We must adapt to nature and we must be aware of nature's limitations. The unspoiled, beautiful Colorado that stirred me, quoting him, so deeply, growing up here has fallen prey to unchecked immigration-induced population growth. We must abide by the carrying capacity. He was a leader in the Sierra Club fight over immigration. Well, what's wrong with that? Humans can do a lot more than any other creature. Humans can try to displace these difficult decisions onto nature, but it is far more complicated than that. The rate of consumption of resources is far more important than just the sheer numbers of the population. Human beings fluctuate in their thinking about reproduction, and what these folks seem particularly not to notice is that the rate of population growth in the United States is at the lowest in a century. It's starting from a big base, that's true, but it has leveled out. The drop in immigration is significant in that, we've already covered that, but also the drop in the reproduction of native-born Americans. So it's an interesting idea. The baby boomers are aging. We certainly have that evidence. The workforce issues raised here are significant, and overpopulation is not the thing for those of us who are baby boomers to fear. Is a lack of a labor force to see us through the tough times ahead. So, okay, so I propose, building quickly off of Alan's thing, that the environmentalists who are tempted by this notion of inherent limits to growth from natural resources should have to take at least half an hour on Madison Grant's birthday. And Madison Grant's birthday is November 19th. He's born in 1965, and there should just be a hard half hour every environmentalist to think about how wonderful it is that conservationist Madison Grant helped to preserve the redwoods. We are in so much happier state from having those redwoods, and that's the same guy Alan Kraut just walked us through, who had anti-Semitism to the nth power and so on. So just reflect on that, reflect that this man, Madison Grant, was a great preservationist of nature and also had abhorrent attitudes towards his fellow human beings. Last item, very quickly, 3.5 seconds really, assimilation. Assimilation is a word, and we've had some good discussions of it. Assimilation is a word and a concept that has had a rough run over the last century. It's a word where we want to breathe deeply and reconsider and repurpose it very carefully, because we need that word to be in good health, and we need it to be robust, and we need it to be reflected on so that we can tell the difference between coercive assimilation and invitational assimilation. And history is abundant in case studies of both of those. The settlement houses of the late 19th century and early 20th century had some elements of coercion, and they also had invitational elements. Come in. Join us. Tell us about yourselves. Fit in. And as a member of the National Council on the Humanities Board, where we review proposals, I can tell you what is going on in humanities funding in this nation is so wonderfully reminiscent of those settlement houses, the settlement houses that used literature and drama and theater as so much of a part of their persuasion and invitation. The National Endowment for the Humanities, I'm happy to say, to tell you, taxpayers, your dollars are going to things very much in that spirit of welcome to our world, with veterans, with people, working class people trying to rise to different occupations, with all sorts of people. The humanities are really in that spirit. So that is the dream, is to take the concept of assimilation, to look for cautionary tales where it was used coercively, and to look for the invitational, inspirational examples, and to get over Star Trek. Because, I didn't know this until very recently, but the most hated villains in Star Trek's many incarnations have been the kind of creatures called the Borgs, and they are cyborgs, and they are very, does anybody know the Borgs already? You probably know them better than I do, because I wouldn't want to know them or meet them, I'm sure of that. So they are a collective, and they are kind of a group mind, and they approach other planets and other species in the universe, and they say, "We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated." So what we need is some just delightful creatures. I don't care if they're furry or not, it doesn't really matter. But we need some popular culture producers to give us some assimilators who are delightful, who are welcoming, who are pleasant, and who do not do it against our will, and who just say, join us. And I know that there is a young person with talents I will never be able to imagine who could sketch that right now, who could just sketch these delightful creatures who welcome you into their world, and they have to use the word assimilate, but they have to give it a whole other meaning than what those Borgs had in mind. Thank you. Actually, I misspoke horribly there. People probably noticed that. The last phrase there, what the Borgs had in mind, they didn't have minds. They gave those up. So good luck, Borgs, having anything in mind. I'm glad I clarified that.
Thanks, Patty. Big hand for Patty Limerick. We have time for questions. And as always, our wonderful Crimson Club members will be going around with microphones. Please wait till they get there, and I'll try and keep a tally of the order of hands going up.
Hi, I was going to ask you about Jill Lepore's latest in New Yorker, but your last comment made me first ask, Lawrence Lessig has been describing now broadcast journalism at a time of economic growth as being key to bring us together, because we had 50 million people watching Judgment at Nuremberg as they got interrupted by the Selma riots. So we could link up two things at the same time as a mass and bring things together. But the question I was going to ask, and that might be something to be built on, but is Jill Lepore was talking about in our darkest hour in the 1930s how we were suffering, and we started having teach-ins in schools across the country. Is that something that we could be thinking about also, having a 21st century vision of teach-ins in public schools?
Well, I fear I didn't finish Jill's article, and I've been intending to do something about that, but not in time. So I'm going to step away from the podium and get it on my phone and read it. No, I'm not going to do that. But I am going to say, I think this is a question full of implications, because it is time to be very innovative and just kind of uncontrolled, and thinking of what counts as meaningful communication. So you are such good sports, and you were sitting here practicing a custom that came from medieval Europe, nearly a millennium ago, of people sitting in lectures while this person stands up and talks. So young folks are so much more able to come up with forms of communication, whether those are memes or whatever. So just that challenge of thinking, yes, education, yes, but maybe education in a whole other mode than what we have practiced. The phrase, okay, boomer, is thought to be pejorative and negative. I think it's an olive branch, intergenerational olive branch, with it's olive branch sharpened to a kind of sharp point at the end, which is not the worst thing to do with an olive branch. But I wouldn't be the one to say, we have this figured out. We know, I couldn't agree with you more, that more engaged exchange and conversation, and something that is better than that, oh, it's so noble and it's so pathetic. Fact-checking? Oh, fact-checking is so noble, and people work so hard at it, and it doesn't advance the ball at all. It's just the people who already were on board with the results of the fact-checking are, yeah, I knew that. Oh, Lord. So something that really says, this is confirmation bias, this is how you deal with it. If people have expectations and are only... So I just think there's so much, it's so exciting and so delightful to think what could happen with animation, with all kinds of stuff. So yes, but I'm not in charge, is the good news of how to present that, because, I don't know, sense of humor is very useful until it isn't, so...
Hi, so I'm just wondering, in terms of the population and the demographics that you mentioned, do you think that immigrants will actually benefit the increasing elder population that's projected in the next 50 years, when our population pyramid basically looks more like Japan, and
Right.
there's a smaller working force? You think, just your opinion, you think immigrants will really benefit in that area of the United States economy?
Yes, thank you. In fact, when Dick Lamb and I have done our debates, we get right there, because his naivete in thinking that, I don't know what, that something will come in with all of these old people that will relieve, oh, young people, oh, I'm sorry, oh, I'm really sorry, because there's a lot of us, and we are going to be crabby, because we are the ones who said, don't trust anyone over 30. Well, that didn't work out. So we are the ones who are extremely surprised by aging. Now, where did that come from? So it's just, so to relieve you, and this is, I guess I'm just going to say this in totally cynical terms, if we don't have a bunch of folks who see elder care as something they want to do and find pleasure in, you guys are really in a mess, because my parents were in very rough shape in their late 80s. My sister, who is quite conservative and not a particular supporter of immigration rights, she and I went to the hospital cafeteria, and we had watched a couple of Filipino people deal with our poor, burdened, troubled parents who were not making an ounce of sense, really, in their conduct there. But these folks were so kind to them. And we went to the cafeteria, and my sister said, my heart has been changed from that. So I don't know what else can happen, because the demographics are just not subtle about the disproportion of the elderly either just about, well, I don't know, they're all running for president. That's what they're all doing now. They're all just doing that. And that's not necessarily going to help. I don't know if maybe it will help. I don't know. So, but I just think that is such an essential labor force thing. And I know I'm sounding exploitative of immigrant labor, but they saved us. Those folks saved us in a time where we couldn't save ourselves. And Zenny was the Filipina who was so kind. And my sister and I just dreamed of having Zenny come live with us. And we would come home from a hard day at school, and Zenny would say, "Would you like some lemonade?" And we go, "Yes, I would, Zenny. That's so kind." And so anyway, so I'm not ready for Zenny just yet, but yes. And I just don't see that as subtle. It's not something that you have to sit and look at those demographic arrangements and think, oh, what could that mean? It's just so, this is when we're going to close the borders? That's just named Mike. That one person just... I know, but Mike is the other fellow here.
Thanks, Patty.
Okay.
So you give us these stories of compassion in the desert. And when we think about immigration, this is something that's physically felt very regionally, especially in the South and Southwest, but debated politically across the nation. How do we teach compassion for something that we no longer meet these people in the desert, but we talk about them from afar?
Right.
How do we keep that compassion forward and physical and teachable?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that question because, as I said, I try to think, have I actually met people who would stand in the presence of a person dying of thirst and refuse them water? And I've attended one or two pretty weird department meetings, we'll just say that. So just that was gratuitous and unnecessary. I've seen one or two people that I think my problem was that I am a Rotarian, and I would go to my Rotary meetings at noon on Fridays where there's just, oh, let's help with this and let's help with that, and then I would go to a department meeting and it seemed that the world had contracted to be when so join Rotary, young people. That will help with your future as well. So anyway, I think the question is, it's almost tied exactly to his issue about communication, because no, it does not work if somebody is facing very bad hardship and they're completely out of your range of vision, and you don't know them, and you don't know their mother, and you don't know their daughter, and you don't know anything. And there's so much of that. The compassion fatigue is an important term, because how can you keep responding to that? So I believe I'm going to tell one story of two things that I thought, well, that worked. So I believe that there are ways of, certainly YouTube is a possibility in different ways to convey that, although it is a little bit on the edge of exploiting suffering to do such a thing. So the Border Institute, which is in Nogales, named after the great Arizona priests. Anyway, I took a bunch of our people, Center of the American West board members there, and we heard about what that group does to help people when they're deported to go back with clothing, because of course they take your belt away and then you don't have a belt and you're taken back. So my board members for the Center of the American West, who are a kind group of people who had never thought about that. The first really funny thing is that the priest says, well, we do need belts and we need trousers, and then he looked at our group and he said, you're all too big. A little bit portly in some of our group there, and so that's not going to work for what they need. But people were just, when we're getting on the bus, my people were just saying, how can we make a difference for the Keno, it's the Keno Border Institute, how can we make this group function? And as a university, we can't say support this group, but the board members took over for that. So that was something about, there was a picture of what a woman's feet, the soles of her feet had looked like after her shoes gave up and she was walking across the desert. And that was a photograph. We don't know who she was. Her privacy wasn't compromised. But that's quite a picture for saying what desert crossings can mean. So I think that's one thing. Then in Boulder, we have a group called the Modus Theater, and they have encapsulated the stories of DACA kids, helped them write these so that they are 10 or 12 minutes that really tell you what it is like to live without documents. And then people from who are not DACA kids by a long shot are recruited to read those stories on behalf of the DACA kids. So I did that. The first group they did very publicly was law enforcement officials in Boulder read those stories. And I wanted, it's not competitive, I certainly don't have a competitive streak, but I wanted something that would be as interesting as law enforcement people. So I had 3 fraternity presidents, CU fraternity presidents join me, and they were so spectacular and just going all out in empathy. And so I think there are things like that. Does it scale up, as we always used to have to ask about these things? I don't care if it scales up. Having that evening with these 3 fraternity gentlemen join me, did that change the balance of opinion? Will that show up in the polls? I don't know. And it doesn't really matter to me, because to be there and to see that happen was such a spectacular moment of liking our species very much, just becoming enchanted again with our, as I am right now, looking at all of you, enchanted by what a cool species we have. That might be a good note to, you think?